Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Paul Cobb, Chairman here in Australia of the Western Front Association. On behalf of the Australian and New Zealand branches, we are very glad to be part of this international edition of the successful webinar program of the association. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Paul Cobb as our guest speaker. Paul is well known in Australia and New Zealand through his visits in which he has conducted research into the New Zealand and Australian role in the First World War. He has spoken widely, published a number of articles in the Stand 2 journal, and is the author of the military history book, From L 1916. He is the current chairman of the Wiltshire branch of the Western Front Association. There are many people here joining us from kindred organisations, and I'd like to acknowledge the important role that Elizabeth Morey has undertaken in New Zealand. Please join me in inviting Paul Cobb to present a talk on General Sir John Monash and his operations in the Great War. Paul.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you very much for the introduction, Paul, and everybody who has joined us today. I would stress that this talk was prepared some years ago for United Kingdom audiences, but for today's webinar, I've condensed the life of Sir John Monash to about 57 minutes, so we'll see how that pans out. We'll be looking at his life before the Great War, briefly during the Great War, because clearly that's a massive subject on its own, and then his life once he returned to Australia, and then commemoration thereafter. Now, the family's story really starts with his father, Louis, who came from Poznan province in Prussia, and he moved to Australia way back in 1856 to set up a business supplying goods to people working up on the goldfields as the coastal colony of Victoria started to move inland. He did very well, and in 1863 he went back home, partly to set up trading contracts, but also to see his family, and if he could, to find a wife, which he succeeded in doing. He married a girl called Bertha Manass in Stettin in 1863. They came back to Melbourne, where they had 3 children, and John was the first to be born in June 1865. And 4 years later, his sister Matilda, and 4 years after that, another girl, Louise. Now, whilst his father stayed in Melbourne, the rest of the family did go out to live out in the Riverina area, up in Ned Kelly country. But clearly his academic skills were very good, and by 1877, he'd started at Scotch College in Melbourne. And then, as an example of how well he did, in 1880, he came 2nd in maths, 5th in French, and 6th in Latin. But the pupil who came top in all subjects was a certain James Mackay. He then went on to Melbourne University to study engineering, but was distracted from his studies, which he didn't find very fulfilling. He used to attend Parliament, participated in a lot of social activities, had a number of family commitments, and ladies are certainly something of a distraction to him, and that's another recurring theme of his life. Anyway, he eventually got his Bachelor of Civil Engineering degree in 1893. But another significant point around this period was that he started keeping a diary, plus letters he received and copies of letters he sent. And this has become probably one of the very best collections of private papers in Australia today, some of which, the military ones at the AWM and others in the National Library of Australia. The next thing that really attracted his attention was the militia. And in 1884, he joined the University Company, D Company, of 4th Battalion Victorian Rifles. And he progressed very well through the ranks. But in 1886, the company was disbanded, which was a bit of a blow to him. And quite quickly, we see his evidences of attraction to the army. And he wrote as follows: "Certainly the acquisition of one's first official dress and the assertion of a right to wear it is an occasion to be noted. My joining the company I consider a good day's work, for it is affording me an infinite amount of gratification. My appearance in this gaudy outrig has caused no little astonishment and some amount of admiration among my friends," presumably the female friends. And then a little bit later on in his diary, he wrote as follows: "The matter which is now uppermost in my mind is the prospect of a near fulfillment of my long cherished hope for military advancement. I can scarcely understand why this wish is so intense within me, for I have been fully warned against expecting any ultimate advancement from the holding of a commission. Nevertheless, the gorgeous uniform and all the pomp of officership bear for me sufficient attraction to make this attainment a matter of fierce desire." Anyway, he did succeed in getting a commission in the Melbourne battery, and again progressed very well, becoming major in April 1897. During that period, he did have an opportunity to come to England, to Shoebury-Ness, on an artillery course, but the Victorian government would only pay for his sea passage. And I think this is a good example of the dilemma facing militia officers who are part-time soldiers and also had their own businesses to run. But luckily, his CO understood that he had his engineering firms to run, and this took him away for periods to Queensland and Western Australia. Now, there were a couple of opportunities, arguably, for overseas service, which would have stood him in good stead. The first one was in January 1885, after General Gordon was killed in Sudan, when the Victorian government offered troops. But realistically, I think Monash was too early in his military career to stand any chance of being posted overseas. Then secondly, he didn't go to South Africa, partly because there was no demand for coastal artillery. And later on, he described it as a misfortune not to be chosen to go to South Africa. But I think that's perhaps a slight misinterpretation of the situation at that time. By 1806, 1807, he felt that his military career was coming to an end. But at this time, Mackay was in the Australian Intelligence Corps, which is part of Bridges' scheme to create an Australian General Staff. And Monash was offered command of the Victorian section, which he took. Also, around this time, in December 1909, Kitchener was in Australia, reviewing Australia's military capability. And then he went on to New Zealand and produced 2 reports, roughly similar reports. And this prompted in Australia some changes. For example, the militia was abolished and the new citizen army was created, but even that wasn't sufficient for the First World War, hence the creation of the AIF. The other important development was that the military college at Duntroon was created. And if you want a blow-by-blow account of that, then John Mordyke's book, An Army for a Nation, is strongly recommended. Now, in 1912, Mackay left the Intelligence Corps, but unfortunately for Monash, his post was abolished as the Corps was disaggregated to the 6 military districts within Australia. However, the following year, 1913, he was appointed to command the 13th Infantry Brigade, but he noted that it will, I suppose, be my last military office. But I think already we're beginning to see his interest and his aptitude in military matters, and some parallels with his engineering practice, his control of manpower in a hierarchical structure, his need for order, and so on. And also the fact that the uniform and his position was influential not only in society but with young ladies. Also around this time, Hamilton was out in Australia. He was Inspector General of British Forces overseas, and he made favourable reports on Monash. We'll now look briefly at his business career. You remember he graduated with an engineering degree, and he found employment on projects such as Prince's Bridge here in Melbourne, and later for several years on the Outer Circle railway construction in Melbourne, where he was responsible for building a number of bridges and 11 miles of railway. But once the project finished in 1891, not all of his schemes went according to plan. For example, King's Bridge here in Bendigo collapsed during load testing, and the local paper recorded that the traction engine, quote, mangled an onlooker when it fell from the bridge. Another development in this period was that he studied law because he saw an opportunity to act for contractors working for the government using his law knowledge and his engineering skills. At the same time, he was working for the Melbourne Harbour Trust, but they gave him leave of absence again to go to Queensland, Western Australia, New South Wales to undertake this work. But the 1890s economically was a difficult period for the beginning of Victoria, and funding for public works was beginning to run out. But he set up a firm with a guy called Joshua Anderson, and later on he and David Mitchell set up the Monnier Pipe Company, which became very, very, very well known. And in one of those sort of interesting tangents in First World War talks, David Mitchell had a daughter which called Helen Porter Mitchell, who I'm sure all of you remember was Dame Nellie Melba. Now, as he approached his 40th birthday, he clearly took stock of his life. His marriage, which we'll come to in a moment, was quite rocky. He had no son, he was in some debt, his military career appeared to be running out of steam, and his business was having periods of good times and bad times. However, from about 1906 through to the advent of the Great War, things were much more prosperous, so much so that he was able to give up his legal work. He also planned a trip overseas, and from March to November 1910, he came to Europe, to Britain, and across to the States. Was very impressed by things like underground railways in London, Paris, Berlin, etc. And in America, particularly by their use of reinforced concrete. Subsequently, he planned for March 1915 to go to Japan and the United States to a World Engineering Conference. But as we'll discover, he went instead to Egypt, Turkey, and France, and so on. Now, during the Great War, he had to leave his business in the hand of his partners, and the business generally did quite well. And he had good fortune to have reasonably reliable associates, unlike, for example, Pompey Elliott, whose business suffered quite badly. And at this stage in the biography by Geoffrey Searle, Searle comments that Monash had superbly developed qualities for any large job which might crop up: absolute self-confidence, entire skill in the manipulation of men to his forceful will, a magnificently developed administrative competence, and that's a fairly key phrase, as we'll see later, an intellect which had never yet been subjected to adequate challenge. Now, on his domestic life, I've already made reference to his interest in ladies. In 1888, he went into business with a new partner called Fred Gabriel, and Fred had a wife called Annie, and he recklessly advised Monash that they could use a room in their house as an office. Anyway, Monash got on well with ladies, and Annie was no exception. And by all accounts, Fred really did have to sort of prize them apart on occasions. But the relationship went on for quite a long time. And it's said that the 115 letters or so that he wrote to her were supposed to be one of the longest documented affairs in Australian history. However, in June 1889, he met Hannah Victoria Moss, known as Vic. Her parents came from London, settled in Australia. And initially, she was quite cool towards Monash, having heard about some of his recent history. And they had quite a long and often tempestuous relationship, but generally were reconciled. Anyway, they married in 1890, and soon after, it wasn't a particularly good time for Monash. His father was very ill, then his mother died in 1891. Then in 1892, Vic became pregnant, and in January the following year gave birth to a daughter, you can see in the picture there, who was their only child. soon after, Vic was diagnosed with serious ill health. And then in 1894, she proposed a separation, and he urged her not to go ahead with this. But on the 10th of December that year, she left for England with her sister, and 5 days later, Monash's father died. But Vic came back in July the following year, and things did pick up. And appropriately, the chapter on this period in Searle's biography is entitled A Rough Passage, 1891 to 96. Anyway, they continued to correspond when he was away during the Great War, and we'll be using a few extracts from those letters. But while he was overseas in Egypt, he received a telegram saying that she was extremely ill, and later had one saying she was recovering from her operation very successfully. But unlike his business partners, where he said they had to run the business while he was away, he did actually speak to Godley and Birdwood about the possibility of home leave, but they advised him that the War Office would not allow it. And a selection of his letters have been published, firstly by Cutler in 1934, and more recently Tony McDougall in 2002. And they present quite an interesting slice of the correspondence. Now, we've looked at Vic's health, but in terms of his own health, it never seemed to be particularly good when in his adult life. Certainly, he liked a drop of scotch. He had a heavy work commitment, and he was always a heavy smoker. Before the war, he did try and keep fit. He used to go on hikes and camps up in the Dandenongs and elsewhere with his friends. And he certainly had a fairly consistent weight problem. So much so that Punch magazine at one point described him as a large mushroom. Now, during the period on Gallipoli, he only had 2 periods of ill health, one in September 1915 when he suffered from dysentery, and then November when he had jaundice, which by the scale of things on Gallipoli was pretty good going. Once he arrived in France in 1916, he wrote to Vic saying that he was feeling young and vigorous and not a bit tired, but he had lost 3 stone at that stage. Then the next stage when his health really comes to attention is in September 1918, and you think what was going on the Western Front at that time. Some of his battalions were being disbanded against his will. But he returned to Australia after the war, and his health recovered pretty well. Again, he had quite a heavy workload after the war, and it only really deteriorated in his latter months. Now, I think it's very important as well that we touch upon religious aspects of Monash, because there are various observations about whether there was any discrimination against him on religious grounds. He wasn't a regular attender at the synagogue, and when he was in Egypt, he wrote to Vic saying that he dodged the Jewish community for fear of being drawn into their religious ceremonies. Again, he came to the attention of Punch magazine, who described him as stout and ruddy with a typical Hebrew mouth and typical Hebrew eye. He was quite happy with this description. But during the war, in the background, there were people like Charles Bean who were certainly antagonistic towards Jews, and others that suspected him because of his German background. But his own comments on the question of religion, for example, when he was appointed to command the 3rd Division in England, typically he wrote, "I recognise the disadvantages I've had to labour under to get where I now stand as divisional commander. There's the question of religion, there's the question of parentage, and it's rather gratifying, in spite of all these very solid handicaps, and without any intrigue whatever on my part, to have got the honour and status of my present rank. I'm wondering what my enemies out home will be saying." Then in 1918, again in a letter to Vic, he makes a fairly rare comment indicating his feelings about being subjected to anti-Semitism. And he said, "It's a great nuisance to fight a pogrom of this nature in the midst of all one's other anxieties." There's also the question of his German background. Remember, he was born in Australia. And early in the life of the AIF, there was correspondence about this very matter in relation to a number of officers. And Major John Gellibrand, as he then was, wrote to Bridges saying that he should be discharged if his men distrust him. And we all know Gellibrand later commanded the division under Monash. There are other examples. For example, Thomas Glasgow from Queensland had his appointment challenged because his wife apparently had German parents. But on the combined race and religion point, when he was appointed Corps Commander, Monash wrote as follows. He wrote, regarding certain disabilities of ancestry and religion, it is, I think, a ground for pardonable pride to achieve such a status. And already we've mentioned things like status and so on several times. And I think Monash did have a need for his loyalty to be acknowledged. And certainly he welcomed promotion and honours. Before the war, he was, I think, a little aggrieved that he was a lieutenant colonel, not a colonel commanding a brigade. And this was rectified with backdated appointments to brigadier general for certain officers. Also, he thought when he retired from command of the 13th Brigade, he might get a C.B. And then if he went on to become Chancellor of Melbourne University, he may well get a knighthood. At Gallipoli, his name was recorded for posterity with Monash Valley on trench maps. But also he was, I think, just a tad jealous about others, the way they earn their awards. And he wrote a couple of interesting points. Firstly, about ever so many gentlemen earning their war medals on board luxurious transports in the Mediterranean. And later on, when he enjoyed being addressed as General Monash, he was rather contemptuous of those that he said were with armbands and lace, acting as Deputy Assistant Acting Inspector General of something or other. Anyway, in 1915, September 1915, he was awarded the command of the Order of the Bath and got his medal ribbon up very quickly. He was also happy to provide details for Burke's and Debrett's. But it wasn't until New Year's Day 1918 that the next significant recognition came along, when Birdwood telephoned him to say that he had been awarded Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath, primarily in recognition of his work at Messines. And quite quickly, he wrote home to Victoria Lady Monash. Now, Searle also comments upon how Monash tried to get his subordinates recognised for their work. But interestingly, he picks on three examples, Morshead, McGlynn and McNichol, and says how Birdwood frustrated Monash's reputations. But this isn't actually borne out by investigation. There's some that clearly were awarded following his recommendation. Now, the Great War clearly was a useful extension to Monash's career. And you'll remember that the outgoing Prime Minister, Joseph Cook, committed 20,000 troops to the British government. Mackay quite soon was chosen to command a brigade, and Monash took over from him as Chief Censor. But as the first contingent was sailing to the Middle East, Monash was appointed to command the 4th Infantry Brigade. And he soon joined them down at Broadmeadows to get them ready for embarkation. And on the 22nd December, they sailed for the Middle East to come under the command of Alexander Godwin. Now, once in Egypt, Monash wondered what they would actually be used for. And he wrote that he could only inform the guests that for the time being, Australian troops would be left to garrison Egypt and may quite possibly be left there till the end of the war. That is, of course, unless the war goes on over next spring and summer. In Egypt, he quite quickly came to the attention of people like Birdwood, who made various favourable comments. But quite often, Birdwood would have praise and doubt in the same message. For example, in Egypt, he wrote that Monash was an exceptionally able man on paper, with knowledge, but I am doubtful that he's being able to apply this knowledge in the field, partly perhaps because he does not seem to possess enough physical activity on horseback. Anyway, Monash cracked on with training his brigade and by all accounts did a very good job, and again attracted more favourable comments, and they were ready to move to wherever the fighting was going to come. However, he then had what he described as a very disagreeable on the Court of Inquiry into the Battle of the Wazzir, which doesn't feel any battle honours, because this was the occasion that Australian, and I think more so New Zealand troops, smashed up the red light district of Cairo. And Monash described this as a sickening, revolting and disgusting spectacle. And the Court of Inquiry was largely stonewalled by the troops, and its report was inconclusive. However, there were rumours that they were going to be on the move, and on the 11th of April, his brigade boarded trains to travel to Alexandria and then across to Lemnos. Now, we simply haven't got time to go into Gallipoli in any detail at all, but we know that Monash landed around about 10:30 on the morning of the 26th of April. And during his period there, he got quite irked by Charles Bean, who he felt wasn't giving his troops enough favourable publicity in his dispatches. So he recruited a journalist by the name of Charles Smyth, who worked for the Argus, a Melbourne daily paper, up till about 1957, I think it was, to try and redress the balance. And they promoted between them the term the Fighting Fourth, which Ron Austin then used for his book on the 4th Battalion. Also, Monash was having extracts from his letters published back home, and quite a few people thought this was quite a dangerous tactic of self-promotion. But Monash felt that what he was doing was making sure that his troops and other troops, Australian troops, were getting due recognition in the Australian press. Now, while Smyth clearly held Monash in high regard, we'll see examples of Keith Murdoch and Charles Bean, who were constantly undermining his reputation with people like Billy Hughes and Birdwood. Now, after the death of Bridges in May 1918, James Legge was appointed to succeed him. And this caused a certain amount of outrage with Monash, Chevelle and others. But Legge didn't last very long on the peninsula. He was sent back to Egypt. But again, it's this question of appointments to Australian command that was another subject rumbling for quite some time. Also around this period, Monash made some notes and wrote home about the Australian view of British troops, and generally he was reasonably balanced. And certainly, I think it's quite important, he did recognise that the British Expeditionary Force in late 1915 was not the same force that had gone to France in August 1914. After a period of leave in November, he came back to the peninsula, and he and other senior officers then met Kitchener, who was there to evaluate the whole campaign. It's also around the time that Murdoch published his rather infamous paper on the conduct of the campaign. And Monash and I think a lot of the senior Australian command rather despised this report. But as we know, the upshot was that the British cabinet decided in early December that the peninsula would be evacuated. Now, Monash described this as a thunderbolt, but he recognised that orders were orders, and he wrote that, "I need not say I feel very unhappy. I'm almost frightened to contemplate the howl of rage and disappointment there will be when the men find out what is afoot. I'm wondering what Australia will think of the desertion of her 6,000 dead and the 20,000 other casualties." Anyway, on the evening of the 19th of December, he and the remainder of his brigade boarded boats and travelled back to Lemnos. Now, in the second volume of the official history, the second volume of the 12, Bean states his views of Monash and what he saw as his limitations as a fighting commander. He made a statement saying that Monash was a leader of whom it was already said he would command a division better than a brigade and a corps better than a division. How he could possibly have arrived at that view in early 1916 is a mystery. But he also said that Monash undoubtedly had shown defects in leadership. In contrast, though, Birdwood, just before the evacuation, commented that Monash has, I think, certainly done well. He looks after his brigade thoroughly well, knows all the details concerning it, and is an excellent organiser. But again, we see the Birdwood sting in the tail, where he says, at the same time, I cannot look upon him as a leader in war. But in 1915 and 16, Alexander Godley also communicated with Senator George Pearce, Minister for Defence back in Australia, and he spoke very favourably of Monash. Now, as we know, when the 1st and 2nd Divisions came back to Egypt, they were split to form the 4th and 5th. And the 3rd Australian Division had been formed in Australia and was coming direct to the United Kingdom. And I think Monash and others were looking forward to leaving Egypt. And he left us his views of the country, which, to the best of my knowledge, have never been adopted by the Egyptian Tourist Board. He wrote as follows: that Egypt was the land of sand, sin, sorrow, and syphilis. He later went on to say, everything is dirty, squalid, smelly, and repugnant to any refined taste. Anyway, he did go to France, obviously, with his formation. And in June 1916, Birdwood notified him of his pending appointment to command the 3rd Australian Division. But nothing happened for a couple of weeks. And Monash, I think, grew quite edgy. You know, had the appointment had the political veto, or more likely was the 3rd Division going to be used purely for reinforcements, rather like the 5th Canadian Division was being used. However, everything worked out well, and on the 25th of July 1916, he arrived at his HQ at Lark Hill on Salisbury Plain, very confident in the task ahead of him. And again, he pressed on with that. And on the 21st of November 1916, the division moved from Lark Hill across to France, and Monash was back on the Western Front. Now, initially, the division was in the quiet nursery sector around Armentières, as happened to a lot of units fresh to France. And their first significant action was up at Messines in June 1917, where they're in the Messines White Sheet sector. And again, the division performed well. And Haig visited on the 9th of June, so 2 days after the offensive started. And in his diary, Haig described Monash as a most practical and capable commander and has done well. Then in August, when the division was at rest over near Boulogne, Haig again came back, and this time Monash recorded his view of the visit, saying it was a brilliant success. The chief stayed for an hour chatting to me and my senior commanders. Well, thereafter, the division had a period up in the Ypres salient, and then it was out of the line when the German spring offensive was unleashed. And Monash was away at the time, and it took him 32 hours to reach his divisional HQ. And the 3rd Division was sent down south towards Toulon and then forward to take up positions between Arras and Albert. And it's during this time that Monash encountered Lieutenant General Congreve. And in a letter to Vic, he made the interesting comment attributed to Congreve that said, "Thank heavens the Australians are here." Now, there's no doubt the 3rd Division made a very positive impression on slowing the German advance and pushing them back. We should recognise they were fresh troops who hadn't gone through the trauma of the retreat. Monash himself told Birdwood that the advent of Australian troops has had an instant and extraordinary effect in steadying the whole line. And then later on, he said that he'd made a real and tangible impression upon a very critical situation as I now found it. Haig also visited the division in May, and he made an interesting comment saying, "The Australian is a different individual now to when he first came, both in discipline and smartness. Altogether, it is a most inspiring sight," presumably the 3rd Division he was talking about. Now at Le Hamel, Monash, I know this postdated his appointment as Corps Commander, but this is a great opportunity for him to put into practice his principles as a military commander and as an engineer. Now, we don't need to go into the detail of the battle in extensively because we haven't got the time. But you'll be aware that the German Spring Offensive was seeking to break through to the French coast and certainly to capture the very important railhead of Amiens, but they were stopped short at Villers, Bretonneux. And then on the night of the 24th, 25th of April 1918, British and Australian troops pushed them out of the town, and a new front line was established to the east of Villers, Bretonneux. That's the blue line on the map. Now, the reasons why an offensive was required or desirable in this area. Firstly, north of the river, Rosenthal's 2nd Division was suffering from enfilade fire, and this was partly the consequence of the success that the 3rd Division had under Monash in pushing the Germans back north of the river. Foch was quite keen for some offensive action because they were aware that the Germans still had some offensive capability, and also by taking the high ground just beyond Le Hamel, that would strengthen the defence of Villers-Bretonneux and ultimately the defence of Amiens. Now, I'm sure some of you have walked the battlefield at Le Hamel. You'll be aware the village is not hugely dissimilar from what it was in pre-First World War, certainly not in 1918. It was quite a kind of good battlefield. It hadn't been churned up by shell fire for months on end. This is the view from the Australian start line looking across towards the village, and then the high ground beyond the Wolfsburg. The German line was occupied by their 43rd Reserve Division, which is the Prussian unit. In 1918, it was rated as 3rd rate by British intelligence and was actually broken up in September that year. Now, most of the fighting force is going to be provided by McLagan. But he and other Australian commanders were acutely aware of the shortages of reinforcements coming from Australia. And it's estimated that the 5 infantry divisions were around about 8,000 short at this time. There was then a debate about the format of the battle. Should it be a tank action supported by infantry or infantry supported by tanks? And of course, the Australians had a bit of a hangover with tanks following Bullecourt in 1917. And it was eventually resolved that the infantry would attack and be supported by the Mark V tanks. Now, once the attack started, the infantry supported by the tanks captured the village pretty well. Sorry, I should have said one of the other key features before this was used by Monash was very thorough briefings. And the last one I've picked out was on the 30th of June, when the 250 officers present, they covered 133 items on the agenda. It lasted 4.5 hours, and they provided a lot of small trench maps and aerial photographs to cascade the message down to individual formations. And this was really fundamental in ensuring a clear understanding of the purpose of the attack. But then there was a boost to Monash and his troops. Remember earlier we spoke about how important he felt morale was. On the 2nd of July, Billy Hughes, the 3rd wartime Australian Prime Minister, visited his troops there. But he also spoke to Monash about public concerns about casualties in Australia. There's a further upset on the 3rd of July, the day before the action was to start. American troops had been attached to Imperial and Dominion units for training purposes, but Pershing was keen that he would go into action with an American force on an American front. And he wanted the American troops in the action at Le Hamel to be withdrawn. Now, Monash objected strongly to this because he felt that if this happened, Germans would observe what was going on and it would cause delay in the operation. And he raised this with Rawlinson and set him a couple of deadlines. And the upshot was that it was agreed that any American troops that had been withdrawn would stay out of the line, and any that were still in the line would participate in the action. So the assault started at 3:10 in the morning. As I mentioned, the village was taken fairly rapidly. then they moved on to the high ground beyond. There was the inevitable German counterattack, but this was repulsed, and the area around the Wolfsburg was secured. Now, the French were very pleased with the success of this action, and Clemenceau visited Monash, who made sure that there was a photographer there to capture the moment. Now, in terms of the success of the battle and the delivery of Monash's principles, Monash wasn't probably the greatest victory of the war. But it came at an important time when the Germans were threatening to break through to the French coast. It also demonstrated his sound administration, his meticulous planning, the importance of morale amongst troops, having a limited front with achievable objectives, use of surprise and detection, which if you study the battle, there's various ruses he used, but also how he used tanks, aircraft, infantry, etc. And this prompted in his book, Australian Victories in France, 1918, his famous comments using a musical analogy where he referred to a perfected modern battle plan is like nothing so much as a score for an orchestral composition, etc. And it's appropriate that the Corps Memorial was unveiled here in 1996 and featured originally this etched panel of Monash, which I'm sure you've been very, very pleased about. Now, in terms of the remainder of the war, there are a number of themes going through, such as, again, this business about AIF officer appointments over imperial officers, and then who should be corps commander, and then the question of reinforcements and disbanding of battalions. Now, the Australian government had also been keen that their division should be brought together into one force, as had happened some time ago with the Canadians. And Murdoch had been telling Lloyd George that Australian nationalism was the one great driving force for the people back home, though clearly not sufficiently strong to enable them to vote yes in the two conscription plebiscites. He also referred to how the Australians had suffered at the hands of the British at Fromelles and Bullecourt. There's also the question of the GOC in London, and it was felt that if there was an Australian occupying that position, it would have more influence when it came to repatriation of troops at the end of the war. Now, we come across in the official history an observation by Bean, who says that Monash, though a lucid thinker, a wonderful organiser and accustomed to take endless pains, he had not the physical audacity that Australian troops were thought to require in their leaders. And Bean had a particular view, I think, of what the Australian soldier looked like. He said, and it was his for ability in administration rather than for tactical skill that he was reputed. So he was clearly favouring Monash to take over in London after the war. And as we'll see, that did come about. But then there was the question of who was going to be corps commander. And really the only two likely candidates were White and Monash. And certainly White was very well regarded. Mackay was out of the picture. Birdwood made that pretty clear. Previously, he said that he didn't want Mackay to have the 3rd Division and ruin it like he'd ruined the 5th Division. But there's quite a lot of anti-Monash or was it pro-White support from people like Murdoch and Bean and the war artist Will Dyson. And they felt that if White wouldn't kind of fight his corner, then it's up to his friends to do it for him. And there's also views of people like Hubert Wilkins, the war photographer and later polar explorer, who heard that Monash was a candidate for the appointment. And he wrote that there was immediately a great consternation. We've been talking of the relative merits of White, who does not advertise, and Monash, who does. And Bean had fairly regular communications with George Pearce back in Australia, and Murdoch likewise with Billy Hughes. But Hughes was quite surprised at the weight of support for Monash when he was in France. And in a letter to White, Charles Bean made quite an astonishing claim. He wrote, "You know, and I know, and General Birdwood knows, and everyone knows, that our men are not so safe under General Monash as under you. You know that no one will safeguard them in a reckless waste or useless waste of life, in impracticable or unnecessary stunts, or get so much effect out of them in a good stunt as you can or would." Bean also recorded his views of Monash at this time, saying, "Monash is a man of very ordinary ideals, lower than ordinary, I should say. It cannot inspire this force with a high chivalrous patriotic spirit. With his people in charge, it will be full of the desire to look and show well. There is no question where the interest of the Australian nation lies. It lies in making White one of its great men and makers." Now, later on, when Monash was clearly one of the key candidates, Bean noted in his diary that Monash, for an Australian commander-in-chief, we cannot have. He is not the man. And he even suggested that somebody like Charles Rosenthal would be a better candidate. In terms of the appointment in London, he did again favour Monash, saying that on the other hand, he's certainly a better divisional commander than England and McLagan. Now, in his own diary, Monash wrote that Birdwood told me the commander-in-chief had a very high opinion of my division and of me personally, and gone out of his way to express himself in terms of praise of my work. Now, in early May, Birdwood had informed Monash that he'd recommended his appointment to the Australian government. And in a cable to the Australian government, he mentioned things like, "Of his ability, there can be no possible doubt." He said that almost unvarying success in all the operations undertaken by his division, which I know has the greatest confidence in him. He also recognised that there was certain feeling against him in Australia owing to his German origin. He concluded by saying he had undoubted ability to fill the appointment. Now, the Australian government approved the appointment in the absence of Billy Hughes, who was on his travels, and this was promulgated on the 23rd of May. Then on the 1st of June 1918, Monash became the Corps Commander. And he wrote to Vic about this, and he said, "To be the first native-born Australian Corps Commander is something to have lived for and will not be forgotten in Australian history. The appointment will give me a unique and unimpeachable standing both in England and Australia." But I think we ought to recognise that Cheval had been commanding the Desert Mounted Corps since that was formed in August-September 1917. He also noted that Keith Murdoch had the temerity to send his hearty congratulations. And again, in correspondence with Vic, he said, "I profoundly distrust this man." Now, Charles Bean did change his view in due course of Monash, but he said that he'd worked for command of the Corps by all sorts of clever and well-hidden subterranean channels. Now, 40 years later, he wrote in his diary, I do not now believe this to be true." And also with some regret, later on he wrote of this episode, "Our high intentions but ill-judged intervention, that it resulted in whatever, was probably due to magnanimity of White and Monash." Now, it must have been a distraction, I think, to Monash and others. And Searle makes an interesting observation in the biography, saying that it is perhaps the outstanding case of sheer irresponsibility by pressmen in Australian history. Now, the question of the shortage of men in the AIF, remember that was rumbling when the 3rd Division arrived in England in 1916. And certainly there's a view amongst people like Murdoch that Birdwood would arrange for the 3rd Division to be abolished. But Billy Hughes did embarrass Monash by ordering the return to Australia of some 6,000 originals. Now, as it happened, this didn't work out, and I think it's only about 450 were taken out of the line. Also, before Monash was appointed Corps Commander, the first 3 battalions were disbanded. But then in mid-September 1918, he was ordered to disband another 8 battalions, and he knew that this would cause ructions amongst the troops and damage morale. And as events turned out, this was indeed the case. Now, there's also the suggestion from people like Bean in the official history about accusing Monash of excessive losses. And he writes, the losses of his brigade, division and corps were, if anything, higher than the average of the AIF. Now, I haven't particularly studied the statistics, but I understand that is patently not the case. But in Australian victories, Monash defends his position and says that people under him would acknowledge that the offensive policy was the cheapest policy. And certainly after the war, he wasn't subjected to the accusations of butchery aimed at people like Douglas Hay and Mackay. Now, again, we haven't got time to go into the last 100 days, but his corps clearly played a very important part of that before they came out of the line in October. And when the war ended, he was appointed Director General of Repatriation and Demobilisation. And he got to work in London looking at the task of repatriating about 160,000 troops, plus wives and girlfriends, in a time when there was obviously a high demand for shipping for Canadians and New Zealand Expeditionary Force as well, plus Imperial troops overseas. In April 1919, Vic and Bertha joined him in London. It was also time that he was writing Australian victories in France in 1918. And I think this was quite a shrewd move, actually. He regarded it as an individual memoir, but it's a reasonably objective account of the achievements of the Australians. And he was able to express his praise for the Australians, and to demonstrate to the Australian people back home what their army had done. Also, I think quite importantly, he got his account on the bookshelves in Australia before any official history came along, and it was obviously some years before that started to appear. And also it kept his name in the frame back home. But in November 1919, he returned home with his wife and family, and set about dealing with huge amounts of correspondence and receiving a lot of visitors. But a more pressing engagement was the health of his wife, and she died of cancer in February 1920. Now, fairly quickly, he was joined by an Australian friend he had in London, a lady called Lizzie Bentwich, and she became his companion until he died. Now, in this post-war period, financially he was generally okay, although he did worry about it at times. And he was offered posts such as Chief Commissioner for the State Railways, which is the equivalent post that Harold Pope took in Western Australia. He turned that one down. However, he did join the State Electricity Commission, which was working on schemes to exploit coal reserves in Victoria to generate power. And by all accounts, he became, I've seen him described as a legendary figure amongst the employees of the Commission. But certainly, economically, it was quite a difficult time in the state. He was also involved in the establishment of Anzac Day as a public holiday, and he attended the parades. He was also involved in the project to create the shrine in Melbourne, or what became the shrine in Melbourne. And again, he clashed with Keith Murdoch, who was rather against the scheme. But Monash was quite clear that this was a memorial remembrance, not a celebration of triumph. And there were suggestions that when he died, he should be buried here, but that was turned down because it held that it shouldn't be a grave for any individual. Now, his last official function was as a representative of the Australian government at the Durbar for the inauguration of New Delhi. in December 1930. It seems he had quite a good time in India and enjoyed the visit, and he made a trip up to the Khyber Pass. But he also recorded a view of India that was not dissimilar from the one he'd made on Egypt in 1915. But while he was away, there had been 3 significant deaths. There was Dame Nellie Melba, more importantly, Annie Gabriel, and Pompey Elliott. But thereafter, his health suffered quite a bit, and he started to dispose of some of his papers. For example, his collection of erotic literature was destroyed, which would have made an interesting addition to the State Library. And it's also thought that he destroyed his correspondence with Annie Gabriel. Then on the 29th of September 1931, he suffered a heart attack, and pneumonia set in, as it does. And on the morning of the 8th of October 1931, he died, aged just 66. And clearly this sent quite a shockwave through the state of Victoria and probably wider Australian society. And it's thought that around, or possibly more than 250,000 people attended events marking his death on the day of his funeral. And he's buried here in Brighton Cemetery. Now, inevitably, there would be a lot of commemoration of Monash after the war. For example, the statue here in King's Domain in Melbourne. There's Monash University in Victoria, founded in 1958. There's a lot of streets named after him, and there's a suburb of Canberra. He featured in this poster commemorating the AIF in the Great War. They're presuming the artist had never actually met him. He also appeared on 2 banknotes. His image featured in a rather dubious advertisement. A number of portraits of him were painted, and very recently the John Monash Centre was created behind the memorial to the missing Villers, Bretonneux. Now, in the last few minutes, we've really picked out a few key points of the life of John Monash, and I can really do no better than recommend Searle's superb biography of him, which is still readily available. There is an alternative one by Roland Perry, but it might be worth saving your pocket money there, and perhaps going for something like Pedersen's excellent book, Monash as Military Commander, or his account of the action at La Hamel, which is well worth carrying battlefields. There's also the earlier publication by John Laffin, but I think it was Jane Beaumont who described it as not academically rigorous, but nevertheless a pretty good read. More recently, there's been Fitzsimmons' book, and this one by Hughes Wilson. But when you read the subtitle to the latter, it does question what sort of standard book it is. So I hope that this summary has shown us why Monash is still rightly regarded as such a significant figure in Australian military history, and indeed wider Victorian and Australian society. So thank you for listening.
Thanks very much indeed, Paul. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Paul, Simidus, if you want to pop in, please do. What we normally do now is we try and do a round of applause. Now, obviously, we can't do that remotely, but if everybody who enjoyed that wishes to raise your hands by using the raise hand button underneath your screen, please do so. And Paul, I can tell you now that the hand raising is going up as a silent round of applause for that super presentation. So thanks very much indeed. It's now Q&A time. So we've got a number of questions already posed. There we go. Howard, hello there.
Oh, hello. The question which confuses Australians is, when he got back, why was he not offered state governorship, the Governor General even? It seems that the Australian establishment turned their back on him a little upon return. I wonder if you've got any comments about that.
Yeah, in the much longer presentation I originally prepared for the UK branches, I did pick up this point and comment upon it. that certainly does come through. I know people like Birdwood were quite interested in being Governor General after the war, and so I think does go into a bit more detail on this. But yeah, you're absolutely right. But also, I think that because of his interest in engineering, he was seen to prefer to go back into something like that. Certainly, he didn't want to remain as a military commander. I think he found the war in some ways quite repugnant. But yes, he may have shunned other offers. But I think at the time there wasn't necessarily that acknowledgement by Australia that you might expect. And also, there's an example, I think, of how, as Churchill said, being a nation of short memories. Later on, Billy Hughes referred to Don Bradman as the greatest Australian. So clearly, he forgot about Monash. That may have been off the cuff remark. But yeah, I think the general thrust of what you're saying is quite right. And again, I would suggest that people dip into Cell to get the detail on that.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. Thanks for your question there, Howard. Richard Crumpton.
Morning, Paul. I'd hope we've been at Highworth by now, but thank you very much for the talk. My interest is in Monash at the Hindenburg Line. By the time Monash reached the Hindenburg Line on 29th of September, he could only muster 2 understrength divisions. The third was reduced to 3,825 rifles. He probably welcomed the addition of 2 divisions of the understrength US Second Corps with 35,231 inexperienced, naive, green, but brave rifles to add to the, let's say, 7,500 experienced Australians who've been in concert action since the 8th of August. I've read that the Hindenburg Line was Monash's worst planned battle. The first, the US 27th Division had to take the Hindenburg Line outpost, which the British had failed to capture, without a barrage. They then had to advance 1,000 yards to catch up with the barrage that the enigmatic Kenmure Kempton Knapp, Brigadier General Royal Artillery to the US, I love that name, could not alter before they crossed the San Quintin Canal. And then they had to execute a 90-degree turn. The Americans took heavy casualties, and it took the experienced Australians to cross the tunnel and capture the Leucatto Line. The 46th Division had an easy paddle, but I'm biased. What's your reading of Monash's last battle, which also, in your speech, said coincided with his ill health?
Okay, I haven't studied the operation on the Hindenburg Line in great detail. I know, Richard, you certainly have, and maybe that's a talk for the branch when we resume. I haven't come across any evidence that his health was a real impediment in 1918. There were reports of him looking haggard at times. Certainly the weight of command was weighing heavily on him, and the shortage of troops was becoming a major problem for the Australians. And Hughes was certainly Billy Hughes was quite anxious that the Americans got into the war quickly to relieve the Australians so they could reform. And they would probably have gone down something like 50 battalions. Now, I honestly can't say whether his health had an effect on the planning, and I doubt that the official history would go into that sort of detail. But the interesting point to take away, Richard, but I can't give any substance about his health being an influence on alleged poor planning at that time.
Thanks for that.
Can I mention, in the photograph when Clemenceau visited, it's remarkable how thin he was. But his weight certainly did go up and down during the Great War. But he looked in pretty good shape at the time he was Corps Commander. It also makes you wonder as well, with all the work of Bean and Murdoch, what effect that was having on his kind of mental health. It must have been very, very trying for him. I guess nobody knew the war was going to end when it did. But once the 100 days got underway, presumably it must have helped knowing that maybe the German army was going to be broken before much longer.
Okay, Brill, thanks very much. Chris Weeks. Chris.
Thanks very much for an interesting talk, particularly and especially as I knew absolutely nothing about his family background, so thank you. Related to the previous question, September 1918, as far as I know, after the issue of the attack on the Hindenburg Line, Monash made some very disparaging remarks about the Americans. I'm just wondering if he ever met Pershing, and if so, what happened?
Right, I haven't come across any accounts of him meeting Pershing, but it's understandable why he would have had those views. Again, that's an aspect I've not looked at.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for that. I don't know if we can get your video up, but if we can't, we can certainly hear you. John, we can hear you and we can see you. John, fire away.
Yes, thank you, Paul, for that very interesting talk. I'm interested in the referenda on conscription. Were the Australians serving abroad with the AIF able to vote?
Yes, they were, yeah. And there are photographs of troops lining up in various camps ready to cast their vote. And in fact, as I
also
recall,
a different outcome for the men serving abroad. From home.
As I recall, they voted in favour of conscription, but not enough to sway the vote back home. I was going to have the figures at hand in case somebody asked this very question, but the no vote was a little bit greater after the second plebiscite. But yes, certainly their view was sought. They did cast their ballots. And you come across various anecdotes about people saying that they wouldn't vote for conscription because they wanted to remain a volunteer army, because they wouldn't wish what they'd gone through on anybody else, and all sorts of other views like that. But yeah, the troops themselves did vote.
Thank you very much.
Super, thanks for your question there, John. Richard Owen. Richard asked, how did the Spanish flu affect the repatriation of Anzac troops?
Oh yeah, it certainly delayed it. There's quite a problem I recall down at Weymouth, where a lot of them were being gathered to be repatriated, and there were a number of deaths. If you go to some of the war cemeteries on Salisbury Plain, for example, I was down at Sutton Veny the other day, and I forget the numbers, but there's quite a reasonable proportion of those buried there were soldiers who died of, and nurses who died of the flu at the time when repatriation was underway. I haven't got the numbers to say exactly how many died. I'm sure it's in the official history somewhere. But yes, it was certainly a problem at the time. But nevertheless, the repatriation did continue as shipping became available.
Okay, thanks for that. Martin Davey.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for your talk, Paul. I have an interest equally with the pandemic, and as I understand it, it's probably because of the long sea voyage that the troops returned into Australia, but Australia itself had no incidences of civilian or local, they weren't subject to the infection. It was down to the very strict quarantine of the ships that came into Melbourne, as I understand it. Was Monash, was he party to that decision? Did he make any sort of influence over that?
I haven't encountered anything about that, and most of the accounts I've read of troops returning home was once they landed on the jetty at Melbourne, Port Melbourne, they went off with their families. Of course, the voyage home would be an opportunity A to recover, or B to spread it more widely. And of course, those who died and buried at sea are on the moor at Villers, Bretonneux. But that's probably, again, something that requires a bit more research, I have to say. Whilst I've looked in quite a bit of the AIF, but seem to be picking on things that details I haven't actually gone into. But it's quite remarkable that it wasn't widespread in Australia. I hadn't picked that one up previously.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks for that question, Martin. Glyn Taylor. Glyn.
Yeah, hello, David. Paul, thanks for the presentation. What did Monash think of Birdwood? I'm studying Birdwood and his appointment to Fifth Army at the moment. And when he was appointed to Fifth Army, did he see that as his great opportunity then to command the Australian Corps?
I think he had a pretty good relationship with Birdwood. Whether he knew about these cables that went to Australia with the sting in the tail that I mentioned, I don't know. But he seemed to get on well with Haig and Birdwood and Godley and so on. And I've not come across any adverse comments in his correspondence or in his diary about Birdwood. And I guess it was probably somebody that was worth keeping on side.
Super, right, thanks. Mark Francis. Mark, you're next.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to ask if you consider that Monash's competence as a battlefield commander was either proven during the 100 days or there was still doubt. We moved from a planned offensive capability into open warfare. And of course, you had the assault on Mount St. Quentin, and then rapidly rolled up to the Hindenburg line, which was the subject of an earlier question. So I just wondered about whether you considered that 100 days proved him to be the master of the battlefield.
I think certainly Hamel, which was a small operation, showed how he could apply his skills. I think you're right, there were some questions a bit later on with one or two operations right at the end that were questionable. Arguably, as we discovered with the breaching of the Hindenburg line, for example, there were some shortcomings, but I think that does need a bit more work to find out why that came about. I think the other thing that's working in his favour was the fact that the German army were on the back foot, and they had that momentum. We also have to take into account the shortages, which we've alluded to several times, and his weakened divisions. In terms of his command, quite a rapidly changing situation. So I think he wasn't able necessarily to apply the real attention to detail in advance that he would ideally like to have done. Had he had more kind of set piece actions, then things might have been a little bit different, with days to prepare and get the artillery and tanks and so on in position. Certainly the kind of mobile warfare was a bit of a novelty to most commanders.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
Thank you.
Right.
David, can I just chip in and say, I've just quickly thumbed through Searle to see if there's any reference to Pershing, and there's only two mentions, neither of which comment on Monash's view of Pershing or the Americans. So that might be require some ferreting around in his diaries to get a bit more on that one.
Super, right, thanks for that. Right, we're getting towards the end of the questions, I think now. We've got Kay Ellis. Sorry, I don't know your first name, Kay.
It's Ken.
Hi, Ken. You're now live. Do you want to ask a question there?
Yes, after the war, how did he get on with Pompey Elliott? I believe Pompey Elliott came to an embarrassing end in civilian life.
He did. He committed suicide in hospital in 31 while Monash was away. Elliott, as you sure you know, at the end of the war suffered from quite serious depression. Clearly, the loss of his troops in action had quite a profound impact on him. And I think this is attributable to mental health problem in the family. I seem to recall in Ross McMullen's biography of Elliott that Elliott's sister threw herself under a train before the Great War. But as far as I'm aware, he had cordial relationships with Elliott, and I think he was quite shocked by his death. And Elliott had, of course, been one of his brigade commanders, and quite a difficult character. Bean describes him as bull-headed and pugnacious. And if you look at his grave in Burwood Cemetery, there's quite a nice bronze relief. I think captures that quite well. But I haven't really come across anybody that Monash particularly fell out with on a significant scale. I think he's even to an extent reconciled with Charles Bean, perhaps not with Murdoch. But yeah, I think he continued to have a reasonable relationship with Elliott, who of course was also Melbourne based.
Thank you. Thank you for a very good talk.
Thanks very much indeed for that, Ken. Thanks for your question. We're more or less at the end there, simply because I think we're virtually out of time. So, Paul, you're now live. Do you want to wrap this one up?
I certainly do, David. Thank you very much to the UK branch for the support in this endeavour. Monash is famous in Australia and apparently well regarded elsewhere. Thank you very much for a very informative talk, Paul. Monash was one of the great Corps commanders on the Western Front, and we appreciate the background material that you've provided in relation to his life and military career. Thank you.
Indeed. Thanks very much. This is the point at which we obviously have virtually not possible, but Paul, I'd like to add my thanks again for your contribution to this, and everybody who's watching. This is currently live on Facebook, but will also be put on the Western Front Association's YouTube channel subsequently. We continue to hold live webinars at 8 PM UK time on Monday evenings. The next one is this coming Monday, again at 8 PM, but for the folks in Australia and New Zealand who can't catch that particular timing, these are universally put on some weeks later onto the WFA's YouTube channel. But in wrapping up, Paul, sincere thanks for your contribution for this presentation. Thanks very much indeed. And thanks to everybody for watching. And I wish you goodbye. Thanks very much.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all the steps.